Okay, thank you very much, Wendy. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for taking the time to join this virtual AGM and also for your continued support for the Trust. I'm Carol White, I'm a trustee and I'm convener of the Finance Committee. And along with Rob Buckman, who's our Director of Finance and Resources this evening, our job is to present to you last year's accounts for the year ended December 2024. I'm glad to be able to report that once again the financial statements have been signed off with a clean bill of health by our auditors WBG. At the last AGM, I talked about the finance lessons learned exercise that had just been completed, and I'm going to provide a short update on that later on as well. So following last year's AGM, Jim Gibson, who was the previous convener of the Finance Committee, completed his term of office and I took over his role as convener of the Finance Committee. So I do just want to manage the expectations of those of you who perhaps have become accustomed over the years to my esteemed predecessor Jim's presentation, because he was very keen on describing the Trust finances very eloquently, but with extensive references to the classics. So I just need to manage your expectations and say, sadly, my education didn't reach that far, so there won't be any references this time. So in this session, what Rob and I will do is look at the finances for the last financial year. We'll provide an update on the financial performance this year, and then have a look at what our key focuses and priorities are for going forward. And as Wendy has just said, there'll be an opportunity for some questions at the end. Before I go into details, I want to start by recording our sincere thanks to Rob and all his team for what can be exceptionally demanding work in preparing the accounts and the supporting papers, usually against tight deadlines and with lots of other priorities in a tight financial climate. We do have a small finance team, so this places a lot of pressure on a small number of people. And I would like to formally record our thanks to those individuals for all that they do. Okay, so now I want to have a look at the summarised position for 2024. The slide in front of you shows a summary of the 2024 financial position, and that's the green column on the right-hand side, and it compares key figures with the previous 4 years. So I want to draw out a few points on the figures for 2024. So firstly, on income, you can see that our income was 3.7 million. So that's just over 1 million more than the 2.7 million that we received in 2023. And that increase was largely thanks to 2 large and very generous legacies that were received late in the year. On expenditure, our expenditure was 3.3 million, and that was just under 1.3 million less than in 2023. And just as important as that, actually, was the fact that at 3.3 million, it was also 1.2 million less than was budgeted for the year. 2024 was also a good year for our investments, and there were gains of 205,000, which contributed to the bottom line. As you can see, the trading account only broke even. The trading account paid a management charge of 67,000 to the Trust, which reflected the work that had been done by the Trust, mainly in corporate services, on the trading company's behalf. And in effect, this wiped out the profit otherwise made by the company, driven primarily by the revenue received from the lodges at Carlskew. So taking all of those figures together, this gave us a surplus in the year of 643,000, which was an improvement of nearly 2.4 million on the loss recorded in 2023. So you can see from the figures the positive impact this had on our reserves, which most critically left the Trust with unrestricted free reserves, including those held by the trading company, of 1.27 million, which was an improvement of 433,000. And finally, just on the summary of 2024, I just want to restate really that the feedback from WBG, who are our auditors, was highly complimentary about the running of the Trust's finances. Now I want to move on to provide you with an update on the Finance Lessons Learned report that I reported on at last year's AGM. So just for those who weren't aware, during 2023, in the light of the financial situation that the Trust was in, we undertook an exercise to identify the financial lessons that need to be learned from events and to ensure that there wasn't a repetition. And I'm pleased to say that over the last year, the recommendations from that report, which you can see summarised on this slide, have been fully implemented. So I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations, but some of the key ones covered critical areas such as financial reporting and monitoring, including the regularity and timing of monitoring and reporting. There were 2 recommendations made, so numbers 8 and number 9, which were aimed at increasing financial literacy throughout the organisation. And an example of one of the things that's happened on that this year is that all trustees have attended a successful session focusing on increasing all of our understanding of the trust finances. But I think perhaps the most important element that I want to emphasise is the dynamic 3-year rolling forecast model that Rob and his team have worked really hard to develop this year, and which they update each month. And that works throughout the Trust with senior managers, with budget holders, to explore and understand their numbers to ensure that we are looking at as realistic position as possible. And they update that 3-year forecast on a monthly basis. So as convener of the Finance Committee, I can honestly say that the quality of information and commentary on the Trust finances that we receive is excellent. Of course, we remain in a challenging financial environment, but I think the finance function itself, in my opinion, is working at a high level and is well supported by a highly receptive leadership team. So I'm now going to hand over to Rob, who's going to talk about the 3 key factors that have enabled the Trust to turn around after its difficult financial circumstances last year. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Carol. Good evening, everyone. As was discussed in last year's AGM, the Trust started 2024 in a particularly challenging financial position. Unrestricted free reserves had shrunk to just over 700,000, which is well below the reserve target of 1.2 million. Cash itself was down to 534,000, but 500,000 of that was thanks to what was effectively a loan, without which cash would have been debt 34,000, which is very low. The loss in 2023 was 1.8 million, which meant that the Trust would need to improve the bottom line through cutting expenditure and increasing income by 1.8 million year on year just to achieve break even. So what I'd like to explore here is what really enabled that turnaround that we saw in 2024. I think in this brief story of how the Trust was able to turn things around, there are 3 particular heroes, all of which needed to play their part to enable us to get to where we are. Now, the first of those heroes is the Trust's reserve position, which were held in our investment portfolio. So the first big change that was made was the board undesignated roughly 1.5 million of designated reserves. So those are funds put aside for specific long-term projects. The impact of that was to add 1.5 million to the unrestricted free reserve position, bringing that back above the reserve target. The reserves themselves held in investment also played a significant role. The Trust was able to liquidate 550,000 of its investments to support its cash position. And in the year, the investments generated a return of over 200,000 to the bottom line. So without those reserves, the year would have been much, much more challenging to manage. The second hero is the Trust's ability to save costs in year. Now, I know that those savings came at a price, clearly, but from a financial perspective, they did save the day. As Carol mentioned earlier, the Trust managed to reduce year-on-year spending by 1.3 million. And you can see those cost savings kicking in throughout the year, with quarterly spending moving from 970,000 in Q1 to 865 in Q2, and then stabilizing at 753 and then 735 in quarters 3 and 4 respectively. Without those savings, the Trust would have made a deficit of over 600k, even with all of the other factors in place. So the last hero represents the generous people who left large legacies. Indeed, the Trust simply wouldn't be what it is today without many people's generosity over many years. Legacy income finished the year 1.2 million higher than the previous year, largely down to 2 individual donations who contributed 1.2 million between them. It should be mentioned that it wasn't until late in the year that we knew that these would be booked in 2024. And as with the 1.2 million cost savings mentioned above, things would have been very, very different without these. But all three did come in. So with the support of the reserves provided and the staff and the savings made by the staff team, the trust was able to finish 22-24 with the financial wind in its sails. That brings us on to the outlook in 2025. And as you can see from our latest forecasts shown here, we're expecting 2025 to be another year in which the trust is able to boost its reserves. Income is expected to be about 3.9 million, which will be about 700,000 ahead of the budget position, boosted by over 2 million of legacy income again. Thanks again to our many generous supporters for bringing us to that position. Expenditure is tracking just about 60,000 ahead of budget at 3.3 million. When added to the anticipated gains on investment this year, we can see that the trust is currently on track to generate a surplus of about 687,000. So I guess with the recommendations from the Financial Lessons Learned report well implemented, a surplus of over 600,000 in 2024 and an anticipated surplus of nearly 700,000 in 2025, you may be forgiven for thinking the trust has reached a point of comfortable financial sustainability, but the reality is definitely more complicated. So if we look at this graph here, recent surpluses have corresponded to high legacy income figures, which are far from guaranteed going forwards. As you can see from the blue line on the graph, legacy income in both 2024 and 2025 is over 2 million. And looking forwards, if the trust receives income on a similar level in 2026, then we will generate another substantial surplus. But if we look back at the previous 10 years, legacy income averaged 1.0 million. And in 7 of those 10, it fell below that 1 million mark. And if in 2026 legacy income falls below 1 million, then at current expenditure levels, we'll be back on track to make a substantial deficit. So a key question to us as an organisation is how we respond to this uncertainty and volatility in income levels going forwards. The answer that the leadership team, the finance committee and the board have currently agreed to is to follow the following principles. Firstly, to control costs as much as we are able without having a deleterious impact on the trust's ability to meet its strategic objectives, including, of course, those related to income generation. The second is to use the reserves generated from the surpluses in this year, 2025, to both, one, invest further in the trust's ability to generate additional income, and two, to cover any deficits while the trust experiences potential shortfalls in that transition period. So back to Carol.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Rob. So we want to end with just the key takeaways from this presentation. I don't think it's understating it to say that economic and political uncertainty seems to increase every day. And in that very difficult economic environment where confidence is critical, this places a lot of pressure on our sources of income. And in that environment, also, the strength and reputation of the charity becomes even more important. So despite 2024 being financially very challenging, we've finished in a strong financial position. And I think we need to reflect on that. The second, and we've touched on it several times, is that the recommendations from the Financial Lessons Learned review have been implemented and we can have confidence in our financial systems. It's pleasing to be able to report and hear from Rob that 2025 is on track to be another strong financial year with following strong legacy income performance. And then finally, one of our main challenges continues to be the balance between legacy and non-legacy income and the need to secure a wider income base. But we are committed to continuing to build on these foundations for long-term sustainability. So thank you. And thanks to Rob.